Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The auction was held behind the livery stable in Perdition, New Mexico Territory, 1884, where decent people couldn't see it, and God apparently chose not to look. 7 men stood in a half-circle around a wooden crate that served as a stage. On the crate stood a girl. Not a woman. A girl. Maybe 12. Maybe 13. Hard to tell because hunger had eaten the softness from her face and left behind something sharp and ancient. She had copper-brown skin, black hair cut jagged and short, hacked off, not styled, and eyes the color of dark honey that looked at nothing and no one. She wore a flour sack dress, no shoes. A rope tied her left wrist to an iron stake driven into the crate. She did not pull against it. She stood perfectly still, the way an animal stands when it has learned that stillness is the only dignity left. The auctioneer was a man named Jessup Crane, fat and red-faced, with a voice like a rusted hinge and silver rings on his fingers that clinked when he gestured. "Half-breed," Crane announced, slapping the girl's shoulder the way a man slaps a horse's flank. "Apache mother, white father, strong back, no lip. Starts at $5. He grinned at the half-circle. Crane was not a monster. That was the worst part. He'd had a daughter once. She'd died of fever at age 4 on a homestead outside Tucson. He'd told himself after that children were just small people, and small people were just small currency. Grief had rotted something in him, and he'd let it. Now he sold children the way other men sold mules. With a smile and a handshake, and the absolute certainty that what he was doing was commerce, not cruelty. A man in a black hat bid 5. Another bid 7. Fennick Grail watched from the back of the group. He'd ridden into Perdition to buy a mule and instead found this. His hand went to his pocket. $14. Everything he had. Without a mule, he'd lose his position at the Dorada ranch by month's end. He looked at the girl. She didn't flinch when Crane grabbed her arm and turned her for inspection. She just rotated. Mechanical. Empty. As if whatever lived behind those honey-colored eyes had left a long time ago and sent only the body to attend. Fennick had seen that look before. In the war. In boys standing in fields full of bodies at Shiloh. He'd worn that look himself at 19. He recognized it the way a man recognizes his own handwriting on a letter he doesn't remember sending. $8, the man in the black hat said. Fennick's hand closed around the bills in his pocket. He looked at the girl's left hand, the one tied to the stake. It was trembling. Just the fingers. A tiny, involuntary, wakchas vibration that said, "I am still in here." His other hand moved to his chest, pressing briefly against the lump in his coat pocket. A small brass button, tarnished green, that had belonged to his daughter Rebecca's dress the day she died of cholera 11 years ago. He carried it everywhere. It was the only proof she had existed. He looked at the trembling fingers. He looked at the button. $10, he said. The half-circle went quiet. Crane grinned. Sold? And somewhere in the back of Fennick's mind, a door that had been sealed for 11 years cracked open 1 inch. Fennick paid. Crane untied the rope from the stake and handed the end to Fennick like a leash. Fennick looked at the rope. He looked at the girl. He pulled his knife from his belt, a bone-handled blade, old and nicked. and cut the rope off her wrist. The girl stared at the frayed end hanging from the stake, then at the clean skin where the rope had been, then at Fennick. Her honey-colored eyes focused for the first time, not with trust, not with gratitude, with the terrible alertness of someone recalculating the danger. Crane watched the cutting with narrow eyes. "You know," Crane said casually, "I've got a buyer in El Paso who wanted that one specifically. Paid a deposit. He won't be pleased." Fennick met Crane's gaze. "Then give him his deposit back." Crane's grin didn't waver. "I might just come collect her myself." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Then the girl spoke. Her voice was dry and small, like a seed dropped on stone. "Are you going to keep me?" she asked. And the question broke something in Fennick Grail that he didn't know was still whole. They rode double on Fennick's horse, a gray roan named Grit, for 2 days southwest toward the Dorada ranch. The girl sat behind him on the saddle, her hands gripping the cantle, never touching his body. She weighed almost nothing. A strong wind could have taken her. Fennick didn't ask her name for the first 6 hours because he understood that names are currency for people who have been sold, and she might not be ready to spend. He stopped at a creek bed at midday and shared his jerky and hardtack. She ate the way prisoners eat. Fast, hunched, eyes moving. When she finished, she looked at the remaining food in his pack and then looked away, training herself not to want. Her name was Sparrow. She told him on the second morning, unprompted, the way a person sets a stone on a table, carefully, watching to see if it will be picked up or knocked off. "Sparrow," she said. "Nothing else?" Fennick nodded. "I'm Fennick." She studied his face. "Why did you buy me?" He thought about lying. Instead, he said the truth. "Because I couldn't watch and do nothing. I did that once. In the war. Watch things happen. I can't carry any more of that." Sparrow said nothing, but she moved her grip from the cantle to the back of his coat. 1 inch closer. In the economy of a child who has been owned, 1 inch is a country. They reached Dorada on the 3rd day. It was a working cattle operation owned by Matthias Horn. Fair, firm, no questions about things that weren't his business. The ranch sat in a valley of red dirt and yellow grass, with a bunkhouse, a main house, a barn, and a windmill that creaked like an old man's knees. Fennick went to Horn directly. "I need to keep her here. She's got nowhere." Horn looked at Sparrow standing beside Grit, barefoot and flour-sacked. "She yours?" "She's nobody's," Fennick said. "That's the problem." Horn studied him. "She sleeps in the storage room off the kitchen. She earns her keep." Fennick nodded. It wasn't kindness, but it was space, and space was what Sparrow needed more than kindness. That first week, Sparrow worked without being asked. She swept the kitchen, hauled water, collected eggs, and stacked firewood with a precision that was almost mechanical. The ranch cook, a large Tejana woman named Esperanza, watched the girl for 3 days before placing a plate of beans and fresh tortillas in front of her. "Eat slow," Esperanza said. "Nobody's taking it." Sparrow looked at the plate, then at Esperanza. Then she ate slow for the first time in years. The next morning, new clothes were folded on Sparrow's cot. A brown cotton dress and leather shoes 3 sizes too big. Sparrow stuffed the toes with newspaper and walked like she was carrying something precious. Because she was. But at the edge of every good moment, Crane's words circled like buzzards. "I might just come collect her myself." And Fennick, who slept light, kept his rifle loaded beside his cot. But at night, Fennick heard her through the bunkhouse wall. Not crying. Sparrow didn't cry. She talked in her sleep. Apache and English mixed together like two broken rivers trying to find the same ocean. She said, Shima, the Apache word for mother. She said no over and over until the word disappeared into breath. And once she said something that made Fennick sit up and press his hand against the wall. Come back for me. 3 words. The voice of a child still waiting at a window nobody was walking toward. Fennick reached into his pocket and held the brass button, Rebecca's button, between his thumb and finger. His daughter had said something similar the last time he'd seen her. Come home soon, Papa. He hadn't. He'd arrived 2 days too late. The button was all that was left. He held it in the dark and made a second decision. He would find out where Sparrow came from, and he would bring her home, or build her one. The story came in pieces over 2 weeks, never all at once, never while being watched. Sparrow spoke the way water moves through cracked rock, slow, sideways, only when gravity demanded it. One evening, shelling beans on the kitchen steps, Sparrow said, My mother's name was Deshá. She was Chiricahua. She said it the way someone reads a gravestone. Fennick shelled beans and said nothing. She's dead. 2 words. A door, opening and closing in the same breath. Over the following days, the rest emerged. Deshá was captured during the Army's campaign against the Chiricahua in 1879, taken to San Carlos Reservation, assaulted by a white soldier whose name Sparrow did not know. Sparrow was the result. Deshá raised her daughter on the reservation for 8 years, teaching her Apache, teaching her to weave, teaching her the names of plants and stars and the songs that carry the dead to the other side. Then Deshá got sick. Tuberculosis. The reservation doctor did nothing. Deshá died in a canvas tent, holding her daughter's hand. Sparrow was 9. But before she died, Deshá did something Sparrow didn't understand until later. She took a beaded bracelet, turquoise and white, the pattern of the morning star, wrapped it in deerskin, and buried it at the base of the juniper tree, where she knew they'd put her body. When you come back for me, Deshá whispered, dig where the roots meet the stone. I left something for the woman you'll become. Sparrow was 9. She didn't understand. She just memorized the words. After Deshá's death, the reservation agent transferred Sparrow to a church boarding school in Albuquerque. They cut her hair. They beat her for speaking Apache. They gave her the name Sarah and told her Sparrow was a heathen word. She endured it for 2 years. Then she ran. Caught twice, beaten, locked in a cellar. The 3rd time, she made it to the rail line and hid in a freight car heading south. In Las Cruces, a man named Tully Marsh found her, recognized that a lone half-Apache girl with no papers was worth something to the right buyer. He sold her to Crane for $3. Crane held her for 2 weeks, waiting for his El Paso buyer. But when Fennick bid $10 cash on the spot, Crane took the guaranteed money. The El Paso buyer was still out there, waiting, angry. Fennick listened to all of it without interrupting. The sun was going down behind the windmill. The sky was the color of God apologizing for the day. He said, Do you remember where your mother is buried? Sparrow looked at him sharply. Nobody had ever acknowledged that Deshá's body was somewhere, that it mattered where. San Carlos, she said. Near the creek, under a juniper tree. I marked it with a white stone. Her voice cracked. Not with tears. With a 9-year-old's fury that a white stone was all she could give her mother. She buried something there for me, Sparrow added. I never went back for it." Fennick saw the weight of that sentence settle on her shoulders. 3 years of carrying a dead mother's last instruction and being unable to follow it. That evening, after Sparrow had gone to the kitchen to help Esperanza, a rider came to the ranch gate. One of Horn's hands turned him away, but not before Fennick saw the man through the bunkhouse window, thin, weathered, asking questions, looking around. Fennick didn't recognize him, but the next morning, Horn pulled Fennick aside. "Man came by last night asking about a half Apache girl. Said he represented a buyer from El Paso." Fennick's blood went cold. "What did you tell him?" "Told him we don't keep track of other people's business." Horn paused. "But Fennick, he'll be back, and next time he might not ask." The shadow crane had promised was no longer a threat. It was a footprint, and it was getting closer. Fennick went to Horn the next morning and asked for 2 weeks' leave. Horn looked at him over his coffee. 2 weeks in the middle of branding season? Fennick explained. "Not everything, just enough. A girl needs to visit her mother's grave in San Carlos, and staying at Dorada while Crane's buyer circled was putting the whole ranch at risk." Horn set down his cup. "You're the best hand I've got. I can't promise your position holds." Fennick knew what that meant. His job, his bunk, his small, stable corner of the world, all balanced against a girl's need to put her hands on the dirt above her mother. "I understand," he said. Horn studied him. "Why do you care this much? She's not yours." The question reached a place Fennick didn't usually let people touch. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass button. He held it in his palm. Tarnished green, small, ordinary. "This belonged to my daughter's dress," he said. "Rebecca, she was 6. Cholera took her and my wife in 73, outside Fort Worth. I buried them beside a creek the Army later rerouted. The land doesn't look the same anymore. I can't find the grave." He closed his fingers around the button. "I couldn't find my own daughter's grave if I tried. I'm not letting that happen to Sparrow." Horn was quiet a long time. 2 weeks. Your spot holds. You owe me a full season after." It was the most generous thing anyone had done for Fennick in a decade, delivered in the language of debt, because that was the only language this territory understood. They left the next morning. Fennick on grit, Sparrow on a borrowed mule named Patience, loaded by Esperanza with dried beef, cornflour, coffee, and a jar of honey. Sparrow stared at like it was made of gold. Esperanza hugged the girl at the gate. It was the first time anyone had hugged Sparrow since her mother. Her arms rose slowly, uncertainly, like wings that had forgotten their purpose. Then they closed around Esperanza's back and held. 4 seconds. Esperanza whispered something in Spanish. Sparrow whispered back in Apache. Neither understood the other's words. Both understood everything. On the second night, camped in a canyon below the Gila River, Fennick couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire and took the brass button from his pocket. He turned it over and over in his fingers, a habit so old his thumb had worn the metal smooth on one side. He didn't hear Sparrow get up, but suddenly she was sitting beside him, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching his hands. "What is that?" she asked. He opened his palm. She looked at the button. "It belonged to someone," she said. Not a question. "My daughter," Fennick said. It was the first time he'd said it aloud to Sparrow. "Rebecca, she was 6. Sparrow looked at the button for a long time. "Do you talk to her?" Fennick's jaw tightened. The same question Nettie had asked Cale in your first story. the question that cracks men open. "Not out loud," he said, "but I hold this, and she knows." Sparrow reached into her own pocket and pulled out a small white stone. The stone she'd carried from San Carlos 3 years ago, a piece of her mother's grave. She held it in her palm beside his button. 2 small objects, 2 enormous absences. "We match," she said, and the word match, spoken by a 12-year-old in a canyon at midnight, meant more than belonging. It meant, "I recognize your wound because I carry the same one." Fennick looked at the button and the stone side by side. And for the first time, in 11 years, the button didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a bridge. The next morning, they rode hard, not because the terrain demanded it, but because Fennick had seen dust on the ridge behind them at dawn. Someone was following. He said nothing to Sparrow, but he checked his rifle twice and kept to the low ground where tracks would be harder to read. Crane's reach was longer than he'd hoped, and the El Paso buyer's money was apparently long enough to hire a tracker. The race to San Carlos was no longer just a pilgrimage. It was a chase. The tracker caught up with them on the 4th day, at a trading post along the Gila River. Fennick had stopped to water the animals when a man rode in from the north, thin, weathered, white, with a scar across his chin and eyes that moved like flies. The same man from the ranch gate. He dismounted at the water trough and looked directly at Sparrow. Not with curiosity, with confirmation. He'd found what he was looking for. Sparrow went, rigid beside the fire. Her hand stopped braiding the rope she'd been working, a pattern her mother had taught her, carried in her fingers like a prayer carried in the mouth. "That's him," she whispered. "The man from the gate." Fennick's hand moved to his holster. The man's name, they would learn, was Tully Marsh. And he wasn't just a tracker. He was the same man who had found Sparrow on the rail line in Las Cruces and sold her to Crane for $3. Crane had hired him back, the man who knew what the girl looked like, who had handled her before, who could identify her without question. Marsh walked into the trading post. Fennick told Sparrow to stay with the animals. "Count to 500. If I'm not back, ride to Dorada." She nodded, but her hand found the bone-handled knife beneath her blanket. She was 12 and already knew that promises are words that haven't been tested yet. Fennick walked inside. Marsh was at the counter buying tobacco. Up close, the man was hollow-chested, dirty-nailed, the kind of man who survives by finding people weaker than himself. Fennick stood beside him. "You've been following us since Dorada," he said quietly. Marsh's hand stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about. The girl out there. You sold her to Crane. Now you're collecting for Crane's buyer." Marsh's eyes darted to the door. "Calculating distance. That's commerce. Legal commerce. The buyer paid a deposit." "The buyer paid for a child," Fennick said, "and the child is not for sale." Marsh smiled. The wrong smile. "Crane said you'd say that. He also said to tell you, $10 doesn't buy ownership. It buys a receipt, and receipts can be contested." What happened next took 8 seconds. Marsh reached for the door. Fennick grabbed his collar and slammed him against the counter. The trading post owner, a Pima man named Delgado, watched without moving. "You're going to ride north," Fennick said. "You're going to tell Crane and his buyer that the girl is gone. Disappeared. You lost her trail." "And if I don't?" Marsh said, and there was a flash of something in his eyes. Not courage, but the cornered animal calculation of a man who knows he still has cards to play. "Crane won't stop. The buyer is a man named Escalante. He runs camps south of the border. He doesn't lose deposits. He collects. Fennick leaned closer. Then tell Escalante to come find me himself. I'll be at San Carlos. I'll be standing. He released Marsh's collar. Marsh straightened his shirt, looked at Fennick with the eyes of a man memorizing a face, and walked out. He mounted his horse and rode north, but he didn't ride fast, and he didn't look like a man who was giving up. He looked like a man delivering a message. And Fennick knew. The clock had started. Whatever he needed to do at San Carlos, he had days, not weeks. Fennick walked back to the fire. Sparrow sat at exactly 500, the knife still in her hand. "He's gone," Fennick said. "For now?" Sparrow looked at his face and read the truth in it. Gone didn't mean finished. "There's a buyer," she said. Not a question. "A man named Escalante." Fennick nodded. Sparrow was quiet for a long time. Then she put the knife down and picked up the rope braid. Her fingers resumed the pattern. Steady. Rhythmic. The motions of a girl who had been running for 3 years and had just decided that running was over. "Then let's get to San Carlos before they do," she said. And her voice, for the first time, sounded not like a child asking for help. It sounded like a person choosing to stand. They reached San Carlos on the 6th day. The reservation was a wound on the earth, dry, flat, fenced, designed to hold people by removing every reason to stay. Canvas tents and adobe structures sat in rows like tombstones for the living. Sparrow's face hardened as they rode in, not with fear, with recognition. This was where her mother had coughed blood into rags and where Sparrow had held her hand and sung the death song a 9-year-old should never have to know. They rode past the agent's office, past the church, past the school where children in identical shirts walked in identical lines. Sparrow didn't look at any of it. She looked south, toward the creek, toward the junipers. She found it in 10 minutes. Fennick watched from 20 feet back, giving her the distance sacred things require. The grave was unmarked except for the white stone, flat and round, placed at the head of a slight depression beneath a twisted juniper tree. Sparrow knelt. She placed both hands flat on the dirt. And then something happened that Fennick had never seen. She cried. Not quiet crying. Deep, heaving, full-body crying. The dam of 3 years breaking. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. It scattered birds. It reached the sky, and the sky did nothing because the sky never does. Fennick stood in the dust and let her cry. He understood that this grief was not his to comfort. It was hers to release. Grief is a room with one chair. You sit in it alone. When you stand up, you're not lighter. You're just strong enough to carry it standing. After a long time, Sparrow's crying slowed. She wiped her face. Then she remembered. Her mother's words from 3 years ago. Dig where the roots meet the stone. Sparrow crawled to the base of the juniper, where the largest root surfaced beside the white stone, and began to dig with her hands. Fennick stepped forward, but didn't help. This was Sparrow's excavation. 6 inches down, her fingers touched something. She pulled it out, a deerskin pouch, dark with age and earth, tied with sinew. Inside, a beaded bracelet, turquoise and white, the pattern of the morning star, and folded beneath it, a piece of paper. Sparrow opened it with trembling hands. The writing was in Apache syllabary and English, both in Deshá's hand. 6 words that had waited 3 years in the earth for a girl to come home and read them. You were always worth coming back for. Sparrow held the paper against her chest and made a sound. Not a cry, not a word. Something from a place deeper than language. She slid the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit. as if Deshá had measured the wrist of the woman her daughter would become, and sized the bracelet for that future, not for the 9-year-old she was leaving behind. Fennick watched from a distance, his hand pressed against the brass button in his pocket, his own eyes wet. Then Sparrow stood. She turned to him. Her face was swollen and streaked, honey-colored eyes red and raw. She looked older than 12. She looked 100 years old. She walked to Fennick and stood in front of him, and she said the thing that broke him. Not a thank you. Not a goodbye. "You don't owe me anything," she said. And Fennick, confused, said, "I know." Sparrow shook her head. "No, I'm telling you. You don't owe me. You don't owe your daughter. You don't owe the war. You paid enough." She paused. The juniper swayed behind her. The white stone glowed. The bracelet caught the sun on her wrist. "Can I call you father?" The word hit Fennick like a train. Not because it was unexpected, because it was the one word he'd lost the right to hear 11 years ago when cholera took Rebecca and he couldn't find her grave. Father, given back to him by a girl he'd bought for $10 and freed with a bone-handled knife. Given not as payment, as gift. He couldn't speak. He tried. Nothing came. So he knelt in the dirt, the way he'd knelt at Shiloh, the way a man kneels when he is in the presence of something larger than himself, and he opened his arms. Sparrow walked into them, and for the first time in 11 years, Fennick Grail held a child, and for the first time in 3 years, Sparrow was held. They didn't ride back alone. At the reservation, Fennick had gone to the agent's office and filed a report. The trafficking operation, Crane's auctions, the El Paso buyer named Escalante, Marsh as the collector. The agent was a bureaucrat who might have ignored it. But standing beside Fennick was a Chiricahua elder named Naiche, who remembered Deshá, who remembered the day Sparrow was taken to the boarding school, and who spoke with the quiet authority of a man whose patience had outlasted every injustice the territory could produce. The agent sent word to the territorial marshal. Within a week, Crane would be arrested in Perdition. Marsh would be caught at the border. Escalante's camps would be raided. The machinery of cruelty, built on $3 sales and $10 auctions, would be dismantled not by a gunfight, but by a filed report and an old man's testimony. Justice, this time, wore paper instead of a badge. They rode back to Dorada in 4 days, faster than the journey out because they were no longer traveling towards something. They were traveling home. Fennick on grit, Sparrow on patience, the beaded bracelet on her wrist catching light with every step. They talked about small things, what Sparrow liked to eat, how Esperanza's tortillas were the best in the territory, what Grit's name meant. The conversation of people who have decided to belong to each other and are filling in the spaces between the big moments with the small ones that make a life. On the second night, Sparrow asked Fennick about Rebecca. He told her, not just the death, the life. The way Rebecca used to line up stones by size on the cabin steps. The way she called horses big dogs. The way she'd fall asleep with her fist around his thumb. Sparrow listened to every word. "She sounds brave," she said. Fennick smiled, the first real smile in 11 years. She was. Matthias Horn was waiting at the gate. He saw something in Fennick's face that hadn't been there before, the look of a man who has found the thing that organizes all the other things. "Your spot held," Horn said. Fennick nodded. Horn looked at Sparrow, the bracelet, the steady eyes, the way. She stood beside Fennick instead of behind him. She still earns her keep. She will. But she goes to school too. The real kind. Horn raised an eyebrow. "You paying?" Every cent. You'll be broke a long time. First time, it's for something that matters." Horn walked away, but Fennick saw the corner of his mouth lift. Esperanza met them at the kitchen door. One look at Sparrow, and she pulled the girl into her arms. This time, Sparrow didn't hesitate. Her arms went around Esperanza immediately. The strength of someone who has learned that holding on is not the same as being held captive. Esperanza looked over Sparrow's head at Fennick. Her eyes were wet. She mouthed, "Buen hombre." Good man. That evening, Fennick sat on the bunkhouse steps writing a letter to the territorial office in Santa Fe requesting legal guardianship of a minor child. Name, Sparrow Grail. He'd ask her in the morning. Inside the kitchen, Esperanza was teaching Sparrow to make tortillas, the slap of dough, the sizzle of the griddle, and underneath, barely audible, Sparrow humming. Not English, not a boarding school hymn, an Apache melody, the song Deshá had taught her for carrying the dead to the other side. Except now, the dead had been carried. The song was sung not in grief, but in memory. Not to let go, but to keep close. Fennick listened through the wall and set down his pen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass button. He held it for a long time. Then he stood, walked to Sparrow's cot in the storage room, and placed the button on her pillow beside the white stone she kept there. Two objects, two griefs, side by side, the way they'd held them in the canyon at midnight when Sparrow had said, "We match." The button was no longer just his. It belonged to both of them now, to the daughter he'd lost and the daughter he'd found. He walked back to the bunkhouse, and for the first time in 11 years, his pocket was empty and his chest was full. Years later, the people of the Dorada Valley would know them. The quiet cowboy with the gray mustache who built the schoolhouse with his own hands, and the girl with honey-colored eyes who became the first Apache woman to teach reading in a territorial school west of the Rio Grande. On her desk, she kept a white stone, a brass button, and a turquoise bracelet in the pattern of the morning star. And on the wall of their small house, framed in mesquite wood, hung a receipt. Faded, creased, $10. At the bottom, in Sparrow's handwriting, added years later, paid in full. Not by money, by love, the only currency that appreciates. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to Wild West Talehouse. There are more stories coming from the frontier. Stories of the ones who were sold, the ones who were found, and the ones who were worth more than anyone thought to count.